Great. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here for our second session of our Agenda for Democracy Salon series. Today, we are really honored to have Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut and legal scholar Ryan Goodman of Just Security. Senator Murphy has been a true fighter and a steadfast advocate for democracy and responsible governance both at home and abroad, and Ryan Goodman brings unmatched legal insight into the rule of law and expanding crisis of executive power. Tonight, we'll explore one of the most urgent questions facing our democracy: what happens when the executive defies the law and precedent? For example, this weekend, the Trump administration bombed Iran without seeking congressional approval. And earlier this month, Trump sent National Guard troops to California against Governor Newsom's wishes. So how does litigation work to hold the executive accountable? What role does Congress, especially the Senate, play in pushing back? And what can we do as citizens to respond? A little housekeeping before we get started. This is going to be a 60-minute session. Our Q&A will start around 4:40, but we'll be checking the chat throughout the session. So please post your questions in the chat anytime, starting with the word question in all caps so we can easily identify them among all the comments. We will send a follow-up to everyone who has registered for this event tomorrow with the recording of this call, a transcript of the call, the chat log, and links to the information we discussed today. So rest assured you'll get all of that tomorrow. So with that, we're ready to get started, and I hand it over to Susie.
So thank you very much, Senator Murphy, for joining us, and Ryan for joining us today to talk about the issues with litigating against the Trump administration. First, I'd like to start with you, Ryan, and ask you to just explain a little bit about what Just Security does. I know many of us have seen you as a commentator on TV, but I don't think that they're aware of the amazing work that your organization does and the breadth of the work that you do. If you could just explain a little bit about what Just Security does and what you do, as well as share a little bit with us about the organizations and the key players that are out there trying to defend democracy, how they're doing, how they're working together, and what we can expect from them in the future.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you for hosting the conversation. I'm very much looking forward to it. And also, it's just an honor to be here with Senator Murphy, who's one of the most important voices on these matters. So I'll just say a little bit about who I am, how I relate to Just Security, and then also how Just Security relates to the organizations that Susie just asked about. Just a couple of words about myself, because I think they relate to our topic. I was born in apartheid South Africa. My family left because they didn't want to raise their kids in that kind of a society. So I'm both a first-generation immigrant and have seen a country that thought of itself as a democracy despite abject racial discrimination and anti-democratic institutions across the board. I've then studied both sociology and law. I'm now an NYU law professor, and I'm co-editor-in-chief of this publication that is based at NYU Law, Just Security. And then our masthead, our board of editors, are mainly legal experts, top legal experts from across the country. And we are both a place for legal analysis and for repositories of information. Our primary audience are decision makers. So we think of ourselves as speaking to members of Congress and their staff, lawyers in the administration, diplomats, both in the United States and abroad, members of the media, especially producers and editors and journalists, and the judges themselves, and their former law students and their clerks who are reading our material, and the litigators. So those kinds of decision makers, and then as well, the public at large, but really the people that are thinking about this on a day-by-day basis. And we have done things like develop trackers where we currently have a litigation tracker of every single case that has been brought since January 20th against the Trump administration across the board, against the policies against universities, against the media, immigration, press freedoms, the use of the military in California, what have you. And we have other trackers where we track like the first 100 days of the weaponization of the Justice Department. And we're about to launch another tracker that will show all the ways in which the administration has lifted the guardrails that are in place within the executive branch to prevent corruption. So those are the kinds of things that we think about. I think of us as being part of a much larger ecosystem in which there are many nonprofit organizations working in this space, especially in litigation and the litigation that we track very closely. I think it's good to tell people in this conversation that you can rest assured that these prominent organizations are engaged in strategic communication with one another, information sharing and the like. So it not only includes the attorney generals of a lot of blue states, but also great organizations like Democracy Fund, that's led by Skye Perryman, the ACLU, the Brennan Center, Protect Democracy, Public Citizens, State Democracy Defenders, Democracy Docket, which I think of as more primarily focused on election integrity and voting rights. But these are the kinds of organizations that are trying to prevent the slide away from democracy, that are working on litigating the issues that I think are bringing us all here tonight, which is autocratic reaches for power by this administration that are totally unprecedented. And that's part of what motivates me to get up every morning. And it's part of why I'm looking very much forward to this conversation.
Great. Thanks for that, Ryan. You both have studied the boundaries of executive authority from different vantage points, most likely, even though I know you're both attorneys. So how is the Trump administration's use of executive authority fundamentally different from traditional uses of executive discretion? What makes these new executive orders different from past administrations, including Trump's first administration? And what are the implications for the rule of law and accountability? So I don't know, do you want to take this first, Ryan, and then Senator Murphy can follow up?
Sure. I'll just say a few words. I guess there is such a qualitative difference in what the Trump administration is doing from everything we know in modern history of presidencies, including Trump 1.0. I think of it as vertical or internal to the executive branch, and then I think of it as horizontal or external to other branches of government. So vertically, there is a notion, there's a kind of conservative Federalist Society notion of a unitary executive in which the president controls everything within their administration, everything within the executive branch. This is that on steroids. So one of the greatest concerns that I had, I wrote about it, many people had, if Trump were to get elected, would he, for example, ever order an investigation, criminal investigation on his perceived opponents? He's doing that in spades. And not only is he doing that in spades, but the executive orders, several of them, direct the Attorney General to open investigations, or the Act Blue investigation. He's directing the Attorney General to do it. It's remarkable because the Attorney General, when she was nominated in her nomination hearing, felt the need to promise that she would be independent and would take no orders from the White House because that's the norm, that's the rule. And it's nothing like that. So it's very firm control over the executive branch, also over immigration judges, which are actually part of the executive branch and the like. So I think that's one. And then the second is horizontal to the other branches of government. One of the high points for executive power was after 9/11, when the George W. Bush administration asserted that there was something like a commander-in-chief override. Because we were dealing with such an extreme national security threat, the idea was that the president can override congressional statutes in a war. And Bill Barr has articulated that view. This is not just that, it's across the board. It's not based on a war. So just security, one of the very first pieces, one of my favorite pieces that we published was actually from the former dean of NYU Law School, Trevor Morrison, and another scholar who are not prone to exaggeration at all. And the title of their piece is A Dictatorial Theory of Executive Powers, because if you look at the executive orders, they say that the president can just override statutes. TikTok is a kind of mundane example of that, but there's a TikTok statute, bipartisan. He overrides it. Birthright citizenship. Many people think of that as a constitutional guarantee. It is, but there's also a congressional statute that gives birthright citizenship. He overrides it in the executive order. Border enforcement, it says specifically he can just override congressional statutes. I think that's a large part of it. That is deeply concerning. And then I imagine another one that we'll talk about tonight that I'll just flag, of course, is the relationship of this administration to the courts, even to the point that NPR recently had an interview with John Yoo, which is an infamous name of a law professor with tenure who served in the George W. Bush administration and was responsible for the torture memos, the infamous torture memos, which said things like a president can override Congress on prohibiting torture. He has said this administration is far out of whack compared to anything that they ever did, including, and he highlights the threats against judges and the defiance of courts as two of five things that he actually highlights. And I think that's an important wake-up call when somebody like that actually is sounding the alarm.
Great. Senator Murphy?
Yeah, great to be with you all. Susie, Michelle, thanks for including me in this. And Ryan, great to be with you. Very much a fan of your work and the contribution that Just Security makes. So I agree with everything Ryan said, but I guess I sort of start with what the underlying motivation is here. This idea of a more powerful executive, a unitary executive, right? It does have historical roots in prior versions of the Republican Party, but this is something fundamentally different, in the sense that the motivation here is pretty simple. The motivation is to keep Donald Trump and his allies in power forever. If you really sort of look at what happened inside the pseudo-intellectual underpinnings of the MAGA movement from 2020 to 2024, and a lot of this started before but matured during that time, there's basically two ideas. One idea is that democracy itself is antiquated. It's outdated for this moment, that you just can't run a country on a system that's this inefficient. And the second is that the progressive movement, the left, is an existential threat to America, their conception of America. And their conception of America is a white Christian conception of America. And so that's why Trump says repeatedly during the campaign something that sounds very provocative. It doesn't sound like anything you've heard from a presidential candidate before. He says that the enemy from within is a bigger threat to the country than any foreign enemy, than any terrorist group. And he names who the enemy from within is. It's Nancy Pelosi. It's Democrats, right? Because ultimately they see the biggest threat to the country as being the Democratic progressive left's vision of America, which is a vision where everyone has rights, where everyone has a seat at the table, that there is no privileged racial or religious group. And so what they are attempting to do is pretty simple. They are trying to convert this country from an open democracy to a closed democracy, in which you still have elections, but the elections are rigged in a way that the opposition can never win, right? We see this in places like Hungary and Turkey. And so this isn't just about building a more powerful executive for the sake of building a powerful executive. This is about a transition that they, I think, are trying to expedite so that it's in place for 2026, but they definitely want it in place for 2028. And I think that shocks people when you say it. And some folks think that you're engaging in hyperbole when you call them out for this very deliberate attempt to transition our country from one thing to another. But I'm absolutely convinced that it is that. And I think all the evidence is in front of us from the first 5 months. They are literally following the playbook that Orban used, that Erdogan used, that Vučić uses in Serbia, to almost to the letter. Now, we are a country that has a much deeper reservoir of experience with democracy. We are a country that brings much more fervor to the protection of democracy than these other nations. So I think what they are surprised by and will continue to be surprised by is the opposition. The fact that the American people are not going to roll over like citizens of other countries may have. And that's why we'll survive. But I don't think you can prescribe a remedy if you don't understand what the goal is. And the goal is not just a stronger executive. The goal is the obliteration of democracy as we know it, so that in either the next election or the following election, the Democratic Party, which is his main opposition, cannot win. That they run candidates, but they cannot win because you've contracted democratic space. You have harmed the mechanisms of accountability, the press, protest, opposition party fundraising, to a point where the election only runs one way. Again, I don't think they'll be successful, and we'll talk over the course of the evening as to why that is, but that's the goal.
That's very disturbing.
Yes.
Yeah. To follow up on that, what are the most dangerous or troubling actions that you've seen the Trump administration take so far? And what lawsuits or what congressional actions can be most effective or have been most effective to counter them at this point?
Well, I mean, I'll start this one, and frankly, Ryan will be better at talking about the remedies, because I'll just be honest, the remedies inside the legislative branch are very limited. The Republican Party right now is a cult, and so we work very hard to try to find Republicans and who may break with him, or try to work on medium and longer term strategies so that down the line we can get Republicans to break from him. But they are not willing to do that right now. And so, you are not seeing legislative efforts from the Republican-controlled House and the Senate to try to push back on his campaign of destruction against democracy. Again, in part because the majority of Republicans in the House and the Senate are wholly on board for this effort. Again, another kind of myth that I spend a lot of time trying to bust is this idea that Republicans know that what he's doing is wrong, and they whisper to you behind the scenes that it's wrong. No, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. I mean, there are maybe 15 Republicans in the Senate who are in that category, but 35 of the Republican senators, 100% are on board with the democracy being shattered to the point that Republicans win every election. And in the House, 90% of the Republican House members are absolutely on board with that project. So they are not likely riding to the rescue. So it is ultimately going to be litigation and mobilization that are our saviors, and will succeed, because we can do enough in the courts and we can do enough with public mobilization to stop this. But to me, and I'll just say it quickly, his systematic campaign to weaken the universities, the legal class, and the journalist class is a very deliberate campaign, right? The lawyers who defend our rights, the universities who generally midwife protest, and the journalists who tell the truth. He doesn't need to destroy all three, but he needs to weaken them enough that dissent is sort of at a level that doesn't allow it to break through. And then he's got this separate campaign to legitimize violence and to make activists think twice before they step out into the arena, because either their physical security will be at risk, or in a confrontation that the other side causes, you will end up getting arrested yourself, as we saw happen to Representative McIver. So that sort of idea of law enforcement being used against protesters, violence being used against protesters, tried and true method for autocrats and would-be autocrats. And I think those three areas of focus, the colleges, the lawyers, the journalists, side by side with the efforts to legitimize and mainstream violence, are the things we have to pay the most attention to.
Great.
So I agree with all of that. And it's also the three pillars I think of as well. And in terms of what litigation is able to do, what we're seeing it do, so I think that the litigation is in many respects working. We track all of the cases, which are about now 300. The plaintiffs are winning in 2/3 of the cases, over 2/3. And Trump wins the administration 1/3 of the cases. If ever a court has a ruling, the ruling goes 2/3 of the time in favor of plaintiffs. And I think there are other kinds of like hidden successes in the litigation. So part of the way I think about the slide away from democracy is, what is the rate of change? And litigation can seriously slow down that rate of change. This is a president who did not have a real 100-day honeymoon. A large part of that is because of the litigation. Now, the litigation is successful because his actions were so lawless. I mean, if they had done it in a smarter way, I think they could have done a lot of things that are within the bounds of the law, but they didn't. And if you break it down in the litigation, the immigration policy ones have even higher rates of success for plaintiffs. Civil rights have higher rates of success. Senator Murphy mentioned the universities and the law firms. Each of the law firms that have gone to court have won in astounding victories that are extraordinarily clear-cut. And as some folks might know this, the Trump administration has not appealed a single one. They're just using the executive order to try to intimidate. And then I think as Senator Murphy said, like, just intimidate enough, get enough law firms and lawyers to cower, rather than take clients to litigate against the administration and things like that, or pro bono clients. And with the universities as well, the Harvard is winning, and they will win. But they have to also calculate other kinds of risks, even assuming that they will win in the litigation. So I think that's some of the things that litigation can do. The other thing that litigation is doing is transparency. So there are ways in which litigation is through discovery, in which the government is compelled to turn over information or depositions of government officials, is exposing fraud, waste, and abuse and illegalities in ways that I think people aren't necessarily fully aware of, but they're making the headlines. Those are the kinds of documents that get released through the litigation, and then it's making people think more and more aware. And then the other part of it that I think is an interesting dynamic is that the litigation, to me, is building and preserving the kind of rule of law society. The reason that the administration keeps losing is because they're breaking the rule of law. That public education message, I think, is getting across. I think it's also important that the media understands that, so they see these wins happening again and again and again. And I also think it's important as a signal back into the administration, because there are some people trying to do the right thing. The fact that we have, as of this week, last 48 hours, an amazing whistleblower has come forward exposing a lot of corruption and illegality inside the Justice Department. I have to think that he understands that there's a ready community for him on the outside that still believes in American democracy in this fight. And that encourages those kinds of people to act the right way under these kind of extreme situations.
Well, thank you. And we're going to get to the Department of Justice and Bogey, which I think is really interesting. But before we do that, I want to just ask a couple of questions about California. And this is for both of you, but first to Senator Murphy. We've been witnessing in the last couple of weeks the conflict between the Trump administration and the state of California, not only sending in the National Guards and the Marines, threatening to arrest Governor Newsom, threatening to slash our funding. Is there any movement in the Senate to do anything about this? I know you talked about there's no Republican, there's 15 of them, but there still are 15 that could maybe do something in conjunction with the Democrats, because it seems to be pretty. I know that from the legal standpoint, and we'll ask Ryan about this on the lawsuit, he won at least temporarily. But is there anything going on in the Senate about this?
No, not really. Listen, I'm somebody who's wildly optimistic about our ability to survive this moment, but it's not going to be because Republicans ride to the rescue here. I mean, to clarify, when I say there's 15, I say there's 15 who are willing to whisper behind the scenes that they know some of this stuff is out of bounds. But so far, pretty much none of them have been willing to, stand up and do anything. And, you would need, you don't actually need 10, you need John Thune, you need the leader of the Senate, because, even if you have 10, you actually have to bring a bill before the Senate. And Thune is absolutely not going to proactively bring a bill before the Senate that would get 7 Democrats and 13 Republicans. So that's just the reality, that there's not likely going to be any help coming from the Senate, which means our job has to be in supporting litigation and in supporting mobilization, and we have unique roles to play in that respect. So obviously, what Alex did, and obviously he didn't intend to become a national symbol of resistance. He just, on the spur of the moment, walked into that room to try to get his questions answered. But it still took some guts to walk into that room and to ask a question. But that's in part what we can do. You saw what Cory Booker did, what Chris Van Hollen did, what Alex has done. We have an ability as national figures to be able to draw people's attention to the illegality. And when they see it, particularly as starkly as they see it in California, the mood starts to change, and that has impacts. It really does. There's a story tonight in one of the sort of DC trade publications. The headline is Thune faces brewing megabill mutiny. Multiple GOP senators warned during a closed door lunch that they are not ready to take up the bill. Okay, that's separate and aside maybe from our conversation tonight about the assault on democracy, but it's all one story. Because Trump is more and more unpopular, because people are turning against him based in part on what he has done in California, he has more and more Republican senators who are not willing to toe the line. And so even his legislative priorities are now in more trouble, because we have collectively done a good job at highlighting the illegality in a place like California for folks. So it's all tied together in one movement and one narrative. Yeah, we're not probably going to have a legislative fix to what's happening in Los Angeles, but if we use our bully pulpit to explain what's happening, because it's very unpopular, it raises the possibilities for Republicans, as they are this week on this big budget bill, to stand up and do the right thing.
Yeah, I would have thought that people would have been horrified by what they did to Senator Padilla. And then to add insult to injury, the vice president calling him, making up a name about him. I mean, I just don't know what happened.
So did I. So that night when it happened, it was a night when we were leaving town. So everybody was sort of getting on planes right at the moment that this was happening. And, a few of us, as Republicans were leaving, we're just taking our phones and playing this for them, right? Showing them what happened and begging them to make a statement. Adam Schiff, Cory Booker, myself, and Brian Schatz decided not to leave. And we stayed on the floor all night and refused to let them adjourn until John Thune came down and gave a statement that at least didn't inflame the situation. But that was the best we could get. I mean, Lindsey Graham, John Barrasso, others were essentially blaming Alex for what happened. John Thune at least said, well, let's get to the facts. Let's have an investigation. We couldn't get a single senator, with the exception of Murkowski, to actually stand up and say something. So again, just further confirmation of, a fact that's heartbreaking. They are not going to fix this. They are not going to be the heroes in this story. So that's okay. We'll find other heroes.
It's us. It's going to be us. But let me just ask you, Ryan, a question about California. I know that you're interested in following this. So when we first started talking about it, we thought that the lawsuit regarding the National Guard was going to be decided and that Newsom was soon to get back control, but it didn't really go that way. Can you tell us a little bit about your assessment of what's going on with those lawsuits and what we think is going to happen, what you think is going to happen in terms of the litigation about that?
Yeah. So, big picture, I think that the stakes are enormous. If the president is able to federalize the Guard and put them on American streets and then use the Marines as well, regular armed forces. And they're enormous, not only in their existing use as part of immigration enforcement, but what a lot of litigators and people like myself are worried about is that the precedent that's set now will be used later. And I hate to speak in such stark terms, but for the use of the military to block free and fair elections. And so what the courts do now in saying how restrained the president is in LA is super important to what the courts will then say later. Even to the point that some people think, well, maybe this is a weak case. And the next case, if it's military being used to defy a free and fair election, that's the strong case. Do you wait? Things like that. But the litigation right now, this is one of those situations in which there are these like hidden successes. Even though the Court of Appeals found in favor of the administration, they did two things. One, they rejected the administration's extremist argument that the president himself gets to make a determination as to whether or not to federalize the Guard, even on the basis of, quote unquote, no evidence. No evidence. That's what they said to Judge Breyer in the district court. And Judge Breyer was like, you mean no evidence? They're like, yeah, we have to have no evidence because it's just presidential discretion as to when to use the military. They rejected that. They said they get to review it and they can review it in is it good faith and not just review the statutory interpretation, but are the facts actually the way they are on the ground? And then they actually do give him deference, so they defer to him, but it's not that he has unlimited authority. And then the second is they are circumscribing the role of the Guard. So they're basically saying, you have told us that the only purpose for the Guard is because there's something of an extreme situation and you need to protect federal functions. And they uphold it on that basis. And that's, to me, a bit of a guardrail because I don't know if you all have seen this, but we have a piece that just went up in the last 2 hours at Just Security. It's being reported that the federalized National Guard, California National Guard, was used in a drug raid in the past few days outside of Los Angeles County, in Riverside County. Has nothing to do with protests. They have images from the military on the military's own website. There's no protests in sight. It's just a drug raid of a marijuana production facility. That is in defiance of what even the Court of Appeals said. That is posse comitatus violations straight up, which is the law that says the military shall not be used in law enforcement purposes. And I think that that will now be in court. I mean, that the litigators will bring that, the state of California will bring that. The loss that happened at the Ninth Circuit was only on the first threshold question, under what circumstances can the president federalize the Guard? What's still left to be decided is a big substantive question. What is the role of the Guard? Is the protection of federal functions in violation of posse comitatus? And that's what Judge Breyer is working through. And I think he's about to rule that the plaintiff should have discovery. So we're going to get much more transparency about what on earth are the orders that the Guard is being given in Riverside County, let alone in LA. And I think that might be something in which the courts are willing to stop them, because they see that the president is using the military in bad faith, not good faith, which is even their test. So I have some optimism that the litigation might still be able to put a serious break on this.
Yeah. So how do we assess the role the DOJ is playing? We talked a little bit about Emile Beauvais and the whistleblower who came out reporting on what he had encouraged his colleagues to do. When government lawyers knowingly support actions that violate legal precedent or statutory limits, what does that mean for the integrity of our institutions? And are there mechanisms to that exist to stop it, whether through litigation or congressional oversight? Although I think we've determined that's not going to happen in the next few years. Although there is the oversight of approving, the Department of Justice, Pam Bondi and that type of thing. But yeah, so what can be done to rein in the Justice Department, I guess, is the question.
You're probably better suited to answer
Yeah,
that.
right.
Okay. Yeah. So I think the courts can do quite a lot. And that is what's overhanging these big questions of, is the executive branch operating in defiance of court orders? And then what comes next? Because a lot of the time it looks like they're defying court orders, but then the Justice Department goes into the court and says, oh, but your order was ambiguous. Can you clarify it? Or, on some of the sending immigrants to South Sudan without giving them an opportunity to claim that they'll be tortured there, the government's literally walked into court and said, oh, but you only issued your order, Judge Murphy, for another judge, another Murphy of a different branch. You issued your order, Judge Murphy, on the basis that it was against the Justice Department and DHS, but it was the military that flew them out of the country. I mean, just really ludicrous things like that. So at a certain point, with some of the cases, I do think they've crossed the line. They are in contempt of court. There is a proceeding that's currently in limbo in DC with Chief Judge Boasberg, which is criminal contempt. But the courts have a few tools. So one, the courts, I think, at a certain point are going to have to decide if they give the government what is called a presumption of regularity. So the ways in which cases often go the government's way up into the Supreme Court is that the courts presume the government is engaging in regular behavior and is norm abiding to a certain extent. And I think that the judges are looking at each other. That's part of the reason we do the litigation tracker, is to see the accumulation of these instances in which there are outright violations and the like, and dishonesty towards the judges. One judge in San Francisco said that just said to the government, "You're lying to me." Like, it's just things that we have never really seen in our country before. At a certain point, I do think that, and we're trying to build a case at Just Security, there's going to be a piece we'll write about this, to say the presumption of regularity has to go by the wayside. And that would be, I think, very significant for the Justice Department. They might want to get themselves in balance on that. And then the other ones are things like civil contempt. So civil contempt is something where you could actually put somebody in jail. It's been done before, and it's not pardonable because it's not criminal. You can fine individuals, you can disbar individuals, you can disqualify Justice Department attorneys from practicing in your district. There's another one that people have talked about, which is you could actually disqualify the Justice Department from representing the government in your district. That is a very serious tool, but we might really be in that situation where there is a very serious violation in which they go into court and don't say, "Oh, that was ambiguous." They say what Emile Beauvais apparently said quietly to the Justice Department: "Fuck you, court." That's what he said to his subordinates. We'll just tell the courts they should fuck off. Now, if that, and Stephen Miller says that time and again on TV, they have not said anything like that in a courtroom, But that's the question. Will they at a certain point say, no, this is an executive power, military use, the country's facing an invasion, because that's what they're trying to build up towards. And it's executive authority. The courts don't have a role here. That's what I'm most worried about, but these are the kinds of tools that the courts might have to push back.
I'm just worried it takes so long. I mean, when you said the presumption of regularity, I think that we all have to everyone has to agree that this is not normal. This is not regular. We give the guy deference like we think that he's a normal president. He's not. He shouldn't have deference. And I hope that the courts get there fast enough. I think we learned, through the last administration that taking so long to do it the normal way, we didn't get justice. We didn't get accountability. And I just hope that the courts start moving a little faster. And I don't know, if there's anything we can do to make that happen or the litigators can do to make that happen. But the longer he's able to drag things on and draw these things out, I think the worse it's going to be for all of us, because he's going to keep doing all these things that, get to be completely exhausting and we don't know how to confront them.
Well, I mean, if you look, he has the experience of Hungary and he has the experience of Turkey, but we also have the experience of South Korea. We have the experience of Romania. There are countries that have lost their democracy. There are countries that have had serious threats and have survived. And so, what we know is that collective action inside the institutions that are being attacked by DOJ and attacked by the regime is the sort of closest holy grail that we have. And as Ryan mentioned, well, at the outset, the attacks on the universities and the law firms landed because the first targets decided to fold. Once they figured out that there was no there, right? That there actually was no ability to harm them because the law was on their side, and that if they linked arms, they could do better. And part of Columbia and Paul Weiss's problem was that they did try to reach out to build some collective security, and that early they couldn't get it. But the second round was harder because Harvard said no, and the next set of law firms said no. And as Ryan mentioned, a lot of those cases haven't been appealed because they were just sort of hoping that the collective action would never gel. So this is something that happens much faster, is that if the journalists gel, which is not happening because the media companies are, right now folding, but the states gel, right, and refuse to be bullied into changing their laws or handing their elections over. The law firms engage in collective action, the universities engage in collective action. That you're not waiting for the courts in those arenas, because the just simple act of joining together has an impact. It's happening, not at the scale or at the speed that we would like, but it's happening.
I just want to jump in and just say how much that resonates with my understanding of comparative politics and democracy. There's a piece, I'm actually going to put it in the chat. We published at Just Security exactly what Senator Murphy just said. Instead of using the word collective action, they used the word solidarity, looking and learning from other countries that have saved democracies because organizations have come together, because law firms defend law firms, because universities defend universities, and media defends media. I just think it's such an important way that we get out of this.
You want to ask a few questions?
Yeah, we have a few audience questions. If we could go to those quickly, that would be great. Rebecca Fox wants to know, what's the best way to influence Congress? Email, phone, fax, demonstrations. And I know you talked about mobilization. Perhaps that's the way to influence Congress. But we've all been on these sort of email chains that says, say, call this senator, not your senator, a Republican senator in a red state. Call their office and make your voice known. Does that actually have any impact whatsoever? And if not, what can we be doing then to sort of influence what's happening?
The short answer is yes. Don't listen to anybody who tells you, oh, don't call a senator outside of your state. Do it. The better answer is, do not think about what action to take. Just take an action. Because what we are trying to do is just raise the overall volume level. And that happens by people doing more social media posting, by showing up in person, by just making 6 phone calls a day to whoever, right? So if you are in Washington right now, this week, something is happening. The place is crawling with citizens who have flown, driven, walked to Washington to try to stop this Medicaid cut bill from becoming law. The phone lines are lighting up, right? So 22-year-old staffers are meeting each other in the cafeteria. I'm like, oh my gosh, since the phones just don't stop. Oh, my office too, the phones just stop, right? The anxiety level, you can just feel it is cascading. And this is exactly what happened in 2017. Right at the last minute, the volume level just got higher and we got just enough Republicans crossover. So my advice is always do not spend any time deciding between making a phone call or posting on social media or convincing a friend of yours who you know is going to be hurt by the Medicaid cuts to post their story on their Facebook page. Just do something every day or make 4 phone calls every day. And like, especially right now, because like these next 3 days on this big bill will matter. And if we stop this bill or we at least slow them down, it just starts to pierce his sense of inevitability. And it makes the sort of campaign of destruction on our democracy a little bit harder for him as well. So yeah, not rocket science. Just pick an action and just go for it.
So I want to ask a question about one of the questions in the chat is about the Supreme Court and what's going on with the Supreme Court and your view of whether or not they're going to, they pretty much the question was they put limited power of the executive branch to go outside the express bounds of the instructions of Congress. Wouldn't that now just nullify Trump and Doge? But it looks like they're, approving of the Doge things and what Trump can do with Doge. So what do we think we can expect from SCOTUS and how are they just going to be completely hypocritical? Probably.
I'm certainly not going to say we can expect much from them. Though I do think that the ways in which the administration has threatened judges and has now, as of in the last 24 hours, done something remarkable, which is actually sue the entire District Court of Maryland, which I've never seen happen before in my life. Like, law professors are like, have you ever seen this ever? But I think the Supreme Court I think some of the Supreme Court understand. I think Chief Justice Roberts understands that the administration is off the rails. So I do think there will be pushback, and there's been 2 highlights of good pushback on due process rights of immigrants. Because the Justice Department and the administration was trying to, when they sent the first group of individuals to El Salvador in a gulag of a prison, they did so where they actually sent them a notice before they put them on the flights, and the notice said, you do not have a right to a hearing. It's just remarkable, the maximalist position that they've taken. So I think the court is recognizing that and has pushed back twice on that unanimously. So that's the other part. So I think due process is one place that they might put breakers on. And I also think you said the military might be one in which they would put some brakes on. The First Amendment issues, if you just start to look at all the cases that are about First Amendment issues, I think they might put breakers on that. And Amy Coney Barrett has been a bit of a surprise on some of these cases, siding with the other women justices, which is also interesting in the ways in which that has happened. The concerns are, to me, that one of the ways in which one can best understand the Supreme Court's immunity decision when they gave Donald Trump immunity is not that it was just earmarked for Donald Trump. It is a long-term project of Chief Justice Roberts and Alito to have maximal executive power. Charlie Savage who's a wonderful reporter for the New York Times, wrote an awesome book years ago, and he went into the archives to see what did these individuals do when they were in the Reagan administration and the executive branch, and why were they picked or nominated? It was because of a very maximalist view of executive power. And he says this is a decade-long project, he wrote back then, in which they want to gain a majority in the court. And they now have that majority. And it's manifest in the immunity decision. The immunity decision goes much further than giving a former president criminal immunity. It actually says there's this whole domain in which he acts that is, in their language, exclusive and preclusive, meaning precludes the other branches. And they say that even includes, if the president's, in their own words, was to come up with a sham prosecution of someone. That is his preclusive power over the Justice Department, going back to what I said much earlier, which is the president just controls the Justice Department. And that is their vision. That's the unitary executive vision. That's a maximum. So I'm very worried. And I think that there are certain things that the Trump administration people knew. It's in Project 2025. They told us about it. The one, whole set of cases that I assume we will lose at the Supreme Court is the president's ability to just fire independent members of independent agencies. And the courts already strongly signal that they're going to do that. And that's just one instance because it's a big project for them. So I think for Chief Justice Roberts, it's about that project versus understanding that this administration is off the rails completely. And also caring about one other thing I just want to mention, legitimacy. He apparently does really care about institutional legitimacy. I think courts also care. Judges are admittedly lifetime appointments. They care what the American public thinks. There's scholarship on that, that they even shape their interpretation of the Constitution first based on what the American public thinks is in the Constitution. So I think when we talk about our voices, the people in this conversation, your voices and your expression of your ideas and your voices are important not only to members of Congress, but also even the judiciary, and how seriously they have to take the obligations that they right now are facing given this administration.
Yeah, let me just quickly double click that last point because I think that's really important. The Supreme Court we study in high school is not the Supreme Court of today. These are politicians. These are folks who, have run campaigns for the Supreme Court. By and large, were successful in those campaigns. They are folks who pay very close attention to public opinion. And I think that Ryan is right. When we are out there mobilizing and organizing, we are primarily trying to impact the decisions of legislators, elected officials, but we are absolutely impacting the decisions of the Supreme Court. So, my primary job is still to, try to convince my Republican colleagues to do the right thing, to stop as much of their harmful legislation as I can. But I've turned over my entire political operation to mobilization. So I am no longer raising money for the 2026 election. I've set up this organization, American Mobilization, and every dollar that I'm raising right now is going into putting people out on the streets because I've just come to the conclusion, I think it's right, and Ryan referenced it, so I feel better about the decision now that, what we're doing is also speaking to the Supreme Court. They see millions of Americans out on the streets on a regular basis. They are going to start to really think about the impact on their legitimacy if they don't put some meaningful roadblocks in the way of a destruction of democracy that is actually translating with the public and creating a cause for mobilization.
So I know we have to fight we're getting close to the end and we're asked the wrap-up question, but in the chat, there was a question that there's apparently some issue that some of these lawyers, pro bono lawyers, are drying up. There's not as many of them. Have you been hearing that too, Ryan? And is that a problem?
It's a problem also because if they're one of the law firms that caved, it's a good likelihood that that law firm, which is not being reported as widely, has also dropped pro bono clients, let alone not taken pro bono clients. Mm-hmm. So there is an issue out there in the country. At the same time, there are hidden stories of law firms committing pro bono work. So a couple just examples. We do the litigation tracker at Just Security. We have a large team of pro bono lawyers that are helping us do that. We don't use AI. It's only human talent. So that's pro bono work that's going on. Another part of it in terms of, I saw the question too, I was actually going to flag it as well, because it's about courageous pro bono litigation, and that's what we need. I think that some of the law firms also realize that they have younger generation lawyers who are more idealistic and committed to democracy in a way in which those lawyers are very disaffected by the capitulation by some of the other law firms. And they need to be responsive to those lawyers because they also need to be responsive to the law students that can often choose which firms they join. So I think there are ways in which there are some incentive structures for the law firms as well to think about. And now that these other firms have succeeded time and again in the DC circuit, that's another way in which maybe the tide will shift a bit more in the direction of pro-democracy.
We have time for one more audience question. This is from Susie Wong, and it's for Senator Murphy. She wants to know, what are 3 specific things we as donors, organizers, community leaders should more frequently, loudly request of your fellow Senate Democrats?
Well, I'll give you sort of this will be 3, but I'll give you sort of a broad answer, and it's connected to the one that I just gave. So, traditionally you are asked to support elections, and you send money into campaigns or campaign infrastructure that wastes a lot of your money. They waste a lot of your money because they spend it on 30-second advertisements that disappear. That money actually mostly goes to either digital companies or broadcast companies that are owned by people that are actually conspiring to destroy our democracy. And so it's even worse because the money ends up in the hands of people who are not our friends. The right builds permanent infrastructure. Part of what has happened in the last few years is that we're just getting our lunch eaten online because they own media. And I don't mean like radio stations. I mean, they own content creators online. They just are able to produce much more content on TikTok, Instagram, Discord, everywhere than we are able to. Their mobilization infrastructure is bigger than our mobilization infrastructure. I mean, none of this stuff happens without money. Again, that's why I'm sort of putting all my resources into raising money for the big groups, the move-ons and the indivisibles, and the small groups on a state-by-state basis. And so, to the extent on this call are people, who have the ability to tell Democratic leaders that they need to do something different. It feels like we've been having this conversation for 20 years. Oh, let's build owned media. Let's make sure that we're not just putting money into ads. But we're still having the same conversation. We still haven't done it, in part because and I'll say it, there is a corrupt class of political consultants in the Democratic Party that make money off of driving all of your checks into 30-second ads. Those consultants don't work for the owned media companies or for the mobilization groups. And so when the money goes into mobilization and media, a whole bunch of people don't get their beak wet. So that's my request, is that you as donors help those of us who kind of know what needs to happen and force our dollars and resources to go into permanent mobilization and owned media infrastructure.
So I'll just say Susie, who asked that question, is very involved in this issue. Michelle and I, she's held an event for it. We're going to be holding another event when we're going to definitely be talking about creating new media, creating new voices, having influencers, trying to be smart about how to have our voices heard. So we hear you on that. And
just remember that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are lots of groups out there who are doing it, who have been creating content on TikTok, who have been mobilizing people. So sometimes there's a at a moment like this, like, let's create 7 new things. Well, we could also just take the groups that are really underfunded right now, who are actually doing it right, and help them do more of it.
Sure, we're totally on that, and we're definitely be doing that, and we know that that's where we have to go. But then you even look at New York, and like Cuomo put out all these ads, and the other guy like beat him. They don't learn. Nobody learns. So we have been singing this tune, and we will keep doing it. And one other thing, we're also thinking about saying we'll raise money for you, but we want to know how you're going to spend it.
Right.
We want to know how much you're going to spend on regular
ads. Yes.
And we're trying to put down a pledge that if you want us to raise money for you, then you have to agree that you're not going to put it on TV or as much on TV.
Right.
Love it. Love it.
Okay, great.
Yes. So one of our last questions here is, what should we be looking for? What should we be watching for and be concerned about in the next couple months? And what concrete actions should we be taking now? Which I think Senator Murphy, you covered quite a bit. I don't know if Ryan, you want to add anything in the litigation space as to how we could help.
I mean, I think what I'm looking for are, in the litigation, definitely this question of violations of court orders. I think everybody's kind of aware of that. And today, the Attorney General gave a very horrible answer in congressional hearing on this question. It sounds like, and it resonates with other things that they have said, where they're basically saying we'll listen to the Supreme Court. And actually, I know that Senator Murphy has talked about that as well, that we already are in basically a state of emergency, but that's the big one, if they defy the Supreme Court. And I think that they're holding out for that. So that's one piece of it that I'm very focused on. And then the use of the military, like, are we on this slippery slope? Are they going to try to bring the military onto the ground? Not because they even need it. It's because, back to what Senator Murphy said, it's like a show of force. If you want to have an authoritarian kind of leadership or hold on to power, then you have the strength of the military behind you. I think that's the reason for the parade that flopped, but that's the reason for using the Marines as well. And there's reporting on that. The only other piece I might add is I thought that one of the most effective things that can be reverse engineered is the Tea Party town hall meetings. And we've seen a few of these sparks in the last few months, but especially as we head into the midterms, those moments where constituents are confronting their representatives, especially vulnerable Republicans or purple districts, purple states, and saying, you are not delivering on protecting us from Medicaid type issues to the rule of law and democracy. It's amazing what issues are on people's minds that we've discussed tonight. Big issues about democracy and the like. And I think those confrontations are not only important to incentivizing those people to do the right thing, I think they also are a signal to the next elections as well. Then there are more vulnerable Republican senators. And I think it's what the media often responds to and TikTok responds to. Those are viral moments when there's that personal confrontation between the constituent and their representative. And I think it's one of the ways in which the right-wing media has done very well, because virality is also built on emotion and concerns about deep concerns, existential concerns. A lot of that is built on disinformation in the right-wing ecosystem. We don't have to rely on disinformation. The truth of the matter, I think, is motivating. So I think that's another opportunity where people can make their voices heard in a more direct way and in a viral way.
Well, thank you very, very much, both of you. Thank you, Senator Murphy. You've been one of the brightest lights and the leading voices, and we just commend you on everything you've been doing. And thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Professor Goodman. Both of you have given us great ideas and things we can do and to stay motivated in these, I think, very trying times for all of us. We're going to be dropping links in the chat on how you can contribute to Senator Murphy's mobilization campaign, how you can contribute to Justice Security. This isn't a fundraiser, but if you are motivated at all to donate any money for these efforts, these links will also be in our follow-up email. We'll send you a recording of today, as well as a transcript of the chat and all the links that we put in the chat. Before we close, I want to tell you about our next salon. Our next salon, we're going to dive into ranked choice voting. So that's probably at top of everyone's mind right now after the New York mayoral, but there's some thoughts out there that ranked choice voting can be the wave of the future. I don't know what you think about it, Senator Murphy, but that maybe we can get moderates or candidates and hear from more voices in a way that we're not just limited to the extremes on both sides. So we're going to be having some experts that have explored that issue, and that session is on August 6th at a new time. It's going to be 5 p.m. Pacific time, 8 p.m. Eastern. So we hope all of you can come. We put that, if you want to sign up for that right now, we put that link in the chat as well, and we'll follow up with that tomorrow. So thank you, everyone, and particularly thank you to our co-hosts, and thank you, Senator Murphy, very, very much, and Ryan Goodman. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Amazing.
everybody.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
great.
Thanks.
Thank you.